You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Purina believes no one should have to make the impossible choice between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Through the Purple Leash Project, Purina is helping create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time, I am joined by Prit Buttar, the author of Into the Reich, the Red Army's Advance to the Oder in 1945. Now, you last joined us almost exactly a year ago to discuss your book, Hero City, Leningrad, 1943 to 44. So I guess I should start this episode by saying, welcome back.
It's lovely to be back. Thank you very much.
Diving into this book, which sort of covers the January 1945 offensives. So after, over 3 years of conflict on the Eastern Front, as 1944 is kind of coming to a close, the Wehrmacht finds itself back in Poland. So after having advanced out of Poland at the start of Operation Barbarossa, hey, we're back to the beginning again. But the state of the German armies was quite different than it had been 3-4 years earlier. What had the years of grinding attrition on the Eastern Front sort of done to the German forces?
The landscape has changed completely in the intervening years. In 1941, although in many respects the German equipment leaves something to be desired, the Soviet tanks are more mobile, often better gunned and certainly better armored. Overall, the German tactical advantage is so great and their operational advantage is so great that they're able to dominate in a way that takes the Red Army completely by surprise. And in many respects, it's only by the narrowest of margins that the Red Army escapes being completely destroyed in the months that follow. What then follows is a period in which the Red Army learns how to do mechanized warfare in the toughest possible circumstances, whilst literally fighting for its life. And gradually, as time goes by, Stalin relaxes his very tight top-down control as he builds a team of experienced, proved senior officers that he can start to trust, and he allows them to innovate, to improvise, etc. At the same time, the Germans are going backwards. They have lost a lot of those operational and tactical advantages they had. Hitler is increasingly micromanaging everything. And as with any army where there is a tradition of leading from the front, the casualties amongst their officers and their NCOs have been absolutely devastating. And this really affects the fighting ability of these units. The thing that the Germans have always been good at throughout the fighting on the Eastern Front, and in fact continues right the way through the end of the war, is that in a fast-moving situation like an encounter battle, with even roughly even forces, they can expect to prevail against the Red Army and often against superior forces. But that requires junior leaders who know exactly what they're doing, who know exactly what their superiors would like them to do, and can therefore deliver the goods. That's becoming increasingly difficult by 1945, firstly because of the loss of personnel, and secondly because Hitler's just not giving them that freedom to do what they've always been very good at.
Yeah, and it feels like, especially when sort of looking at the early parts of your book where you're kind of setting up sort of the state of the front but before the offensive, the Germans are still in this position where they are trying to cover too much front with not enough resources. Like that doesn't really end as they retreat back, and the front, I guess, from like a kilometer perspective, shortens because they're losing forces faster than the front is shortening.
I think that's a very good point. And although they no longer have a front running from near Leningrad all the way down towards the Caspian, it's a much narrower front line. Their losses have been catastrophic. They never really got over the massive infantry losses of the first year of the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then exacerbated by the very heavy losses at Stalingrad. Ever since then, infantry divisions have been asked to defend absurd sections of front. In some respects, the 1944-45 infantry divisions have much better firepower than their predecessors of 1941-42. And Hitler believes, well, that means that even though the division is numerically smaller, it has greater firepower, so it can cover a greater front line. It's not really how things are done, because if you have a division that's spread more thinly, even if it's better armed, any casualties are going to blow bigger holes in that front line, and then your better armament becomes almost immaterial.
Yeah, and I guess there's kind of a steady drain in it, or distractions, I guess, away from the Eastern Front, right? The well-known distractions of the Allied landings in Western Europe. But I think
Yes.
in your book, you even talk about a little bit kind of the collapse of German allies in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, like also sort of being a sink into which they have to keep throwing forces.
Yeah, they actually conduct a coup in Hungary in 1944 to ensure that Hungary doesn't leave the Axis. And, this is at a time when they're building up their forces in preparation for the expected invasion of France. They're fighting for their lives on the Eastern Front, and yet they have to find troops and security personnel to carry out this operation in Hungary, in Budapest, and elsewhere. And it's also worth noting that in some respects, the Holocaust really hits top gear in this last year and a half of the war. And you would have thought that at this time, military traffic would be the priority, keeping the armies fed, keeping them fueled and supplied. And yet, Germany still manages to devote astonishing resources, particularly in terms of railway rolling stock, to this ideological campaign to exterminate the perceived enemies of the Reich.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Like they're always hurting for sort of logistical capacity on the Eastern Front, and suddenly, it's being diverted away from the efforts to stop the Soviet advance to these other efforts.
Yes, you still have huge amounts of rolling stock being used to ship prisoners around to concentration camps, to extermination camps, etc. And this is at a time when, particularly in the West, the Western air forces are wearing down the Reichsbahn, knocking out trains, knocking out rolling stock, knocking out railway lines, etc. And coal supplies are becoming stretched too. So we're all familiar with Germany having this perennial problem with oil shortages, but coal is now also becoming critical, because hitting the railways, particularly in the Saarland and the Rhineland, means that even if you can still extract coal from the mines, you can't necessarily deliver it to the railways. And despite all of the legends around Blitzkrieg, the German army, and the whole of the German military, is still massively dependent upon railways to move units around.
So, thinking about the other side of the offensive, on the Soviet side, after the massive advances and the success of Operation Bagration in mid 1944, kind of what's the status of the Red Army? Sort of what are their plans as they stood on the Vistula River at the start of your book, and sort of as they were contemplating their further advances into Western Poland?
Yeah, the Germans have been thinking, or rather hoping, for about a year and a half at this stage, that the casualties we're inflicting on the Red Army means that surely even the Soviet Union is going to run out of people at some point, and it's impossible surely for the Red Army to keep on regenerating itself, keep on coming back at us. And yet here they are on the Vistula now. And Hitler is absolutely determined to persuade everybody this is a great bluff. They must be at their last gasp. I can't think that he really believes that, but he almost has to believe that, because otherwise even he has to admit that actually the game is up. To give your listeners an idea of the scale of what's been happening, British Empire war dead in the Second World War in all theatres, civilian and military combined, come to about 380, 390,000. In 1944 alone, the Red Army lost 2.1 million men. It's just a staggering number. And it's only been able to keep going by, first of all, recruiting huge numbers of men from the territories that it is recapturing as it advances west. And secondly, by giving priority to the Guards divisions and Guards armies. They're the ones that are kept at full strength. And the other combined armies are often, their divisions are often barely at 2/3 of numerical strength. Large numbers of fairly raw recruits who haven't really been trained as much as, say, British or American or Canadian forces would be at this stage of the war. Even the Germans rushing their troops in are probably better prepared than the Red Army, which means that in many respects, the Soviets are forced into these mass attacks because the troops just don't have the skill sets to do anything else. You have this gradually diminishing core of Red Army veterans who have survived all of the horrors of the war and have learned how to win, how to fight. Inevitably, the casualties are always worse amongst the new arrivals, these poor conscripts who just get thrown into these meat grinder actions. The Red Army remains very much a blunt instrument, but it's got better at what it does. It's better supplied, better armed. The artillery, the traditional Russian and Soviet way of war has become better, in particular in the offensive that begins in January. Probably for the first time, really, they absolutely get their battlefield reconnaissance right. So their initial bombardment has a devastating effect. And that obviously then means that the Germans are less able to do their traditional way of beating off the first Soviet attack, which is through a mixture of defensive artillery fire, defensive automatic weapon fire. If you've suppressed a lot of those firing points, it's much harder to stop the Soviets just surging forward over your lines, which is largely what happens.
Yeah, thinking about those early days of their attack here, I know that as is typical of Soviet offensives, it starts in different areas on slightly different days. But how did those opening days sort of go, right? You mentioned the artillery bombardment and maybe some initial fighting. I'm kind of always amazed at these very late war offensives that the Germans are able to kind of mount the resistance that they are able to sort of on the Eastern Front, given their numerical and sort of, I guess, artillery inferiority compared to the Soviet offensives. So how did the Germans kind of manage that early resistance? And then how does it go after those opening days? And obviously it doesn't go well, but
this is an occasion when actually that initial very difficult to crack crust that holds up the Red Army so often in other offensives, this is an occasion where that doesn't really work, where the Red Army gets it right. Konev has massed a huge amount of force in the Sandomierz bridgehead. It's impossible to camouflage that. The best he can hope for is that the Germans might get the timings wrong. They might not expect the offensive when it comes. But even then, at this stage of the war even, there are still plenty of deserters crossing the line all the time from both sides, particularly young recruits who think perhaps my best chance of surviving what's coming is to be a prisoner on the other side, and then I can always be liberated if my side wins. And these prisoners are bringing with them plenty of information that the Red Army attack is imminent, so the Germans know full well when it's coming. In the past, they would have used spoiling barrages, air attacks on concentration areas, etc., forming up areas. They can't really do that because they just don't have the resources anymore. Artillery ammunition is in short supply. Aviation, even when they have the planes, they don't have the fuel, etc. Nonetheless, in some places, they do put up strong resistance, and the fact remains that if you have a German unit and a Soviet unit of approximately the same size, give or take perhaps 50%, the Germans can still expect to put up a very, very good effort and hold up that force. The difficulty, as you've already said, is that the line is so thin and that initial bombardment is so ferocious that the Red Army just blows holes in the line. And Duffy, in his book, Red Storm on the Reich, puts it very, very well when he says, for the first and last time in the war, Soviet forces waiting to attack saw something they had never seen before: German soldiers fleeing the battlefield just as a result of the artillery bombardment. So even where the Germans put up these fierce lines of local resistance, the Soviets can just bypass them. And they've got really good at this. In the past, when they have encountered these strong points, they've just thrown wave after wave of men at them, and the Germans have stacked up the dead around their defenses. Now they just motor past them, and they say, yep, the second echelon can deal with them. We are just exploiting into the depths.
It's very clear that during this offensive, like, the Germans are kind of in the same spot where they put so many of their early war enemies into, where even when a small area would do good at resisting, like would happen in France or Poland or any of these other places, or even in Soviet in Barbarossa at the beginning, there's just too many numbers. There's too many different ways that the enemy is attacking them. And so these small little centers of resistance just get cut off or surrounded or, bypassed, as you mentioned.
That's exactly it. And in the event, an entire panzer corps and most of an infantry corps end up caught between the two big Soviet breakouts. And the Soviets know they're there, but their attitude is it doesn't matter. If we push the front line 50, 100, 150 kilometers west, these guys are never getting out. We'll deal with them when we deal with them. And they've learned this because at Stalingrad, at Cherkasy, they often tied down huge amounts of forces, either encircling bypass German units or stopping them breaking out. And now their attitude is, penetration through the full depth of the enemy position, get into open space, exploit, and these units will, a handful of people might eventually march out from the snow, but they'll have lost all of their equipment, most of their comrades, and they're not going to be a functioning unit.
Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens. And RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra, the official beer partner of the NBA, is bringing NBA fans closer than ever this season with chances to win great prizes, including courtside tickets. Enter now at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Courtside 25 to 26. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 plus. Begins on October 1st, 2025 and ends on June 30th, 2026. Multiple entry periods. See official rules at MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, prizes, and details.
That brings me to one of the interesting evolutions that you see sort of during the war, particularly on the German side, and sort of how military decision-making kind of changed over the course of the war. I have a very specific example that I'm going to talk about a little bit. Don't worry, I don't expect you to remember exactly what you talked about on page 150 to 152 of your book. But it's specifically around the decision-making on the sort of 16th and 17th of January around whether or not the troops in Warsaw should abandon the city, right? So they were concerned that they were going to get surrounded and destroyed, as many other groups of German soldiers had over the previous years. And due to the fact that all decisions had to bubble up to Hitler, he was making sort of the final decisions. I found it interesting that by the time there was a plan that came back to the 46th Panzer Corps, which was the one in Warsaw, it sort of ordered them to shift into positions and take up a defensive line. But most of that line had, by that point, already been overtaken by Soviet forces. And so when I read about events like that and sort of this delay in decision making, I'm always reminded of criticisms of the French army in 1940, particularly due to kind of the slow, centralized decision-making processes that were so beneficial to the German advance in those early years. Like, they benefited greatly from the French doing that. And so here it is in 1945, the Germans are on the opposite side of those slow decision-making processes and the same mistakes. Eventually, the troops would withdraw sort of without orders from Warsaw. And this would be the next in a long line of decisions that Hitler was furious with the army about. But what I found interesting is that I didn't realize that the commander of the Ninth Army, Lutwitz, who commanded sort of that sector of the front, was relieved of his position, of course, as many generals were. But then, like, the questioning on this decision continues until a month or more in the future. And it's so interesting to see them, like, first of all, having these issues and reverting back to this other style of like slow decision making processes, which cost their troops at the front. But then also, like, surely the Germans have bigger problems to worry about in February and March 1945 than a single decision made during a Soviet offensive a month earlier.
Absolutely right. To carry out a witch hunt for, as a result of a decision to abandon a so-called fortress, which was so bypassed and actually so irrelevant to how the operation was unfolding, that even if technically somebody had broken a Führer directive and done it, as you say, there are more important matters, and to devote so much energy, so much mental space to dealing with the fallout from that, interrogating people, prosecuting them. One officer, when he's court-martialed, says, "I can't possibly defend myself unless I have access to the war diaries of my unit so that I can prove what happened." Now, just imagine, in that chaotic situation, someone is going to have to go and get those war diaries. It's not like you can photograph them with your smartphone and send them across, across the internet. Physically, they would have to be taken from the front line back to Torgau. He would have to, go through them, look at them with his lawyers. Just absolutely crazy. You have the Western Allies, surging up to the Rhine at this stage and crossing that. And, on the front line in the West, it's increasingly looking like the Wehrmacht has had it and is just not going to bother putting up an awful lot of resistance. In the East, you have the Soviets just thinking, how close can we get to Berlin before we actually run out of fuel and have to stop? But prosecuting these wicked Wehrmacht officers is actually the most important thing. Absolutely staggering, really.
Absolutely. And you kind of mentioned it there, but sort of after the initial attacks occur, German resistance kind of disintegrates, right?
Yes.
Under the weight of the Soviet offensive. And as the Soviets advance, sort of, why does it end where it ends? Like, the offensive kind of ends like relatively close to Berlin, right? Relatively close to a lot of important targets in Germany, but then it just sort of ends like, I think, like one of the early days of February in 1945. So what caused that decision?
I think the clue lies in Shchemenko, who was head of operations in the Soviet High Command. In his memoirs, he says that at a very early stage in the planning for this offensive, they decided that actually Berlin could not be reached in one charge. At some point between the Vistula and Berlin, they were going to have to stop, bring up supplies, bring up, other assets, build airfields, etc., etc., and then go again. I think actually reaching the Oder-Neisse line was probably at the very, very high end, or even beyond the high end of Soviet expectations. I don't think they expected to get within, 45 miles of Berlin. When they did, inevitably, a few people thought, hey, could we go all the way here? But that's just pie in the sky. There were some people who wrote in their memoirs saying, I think that if we'd had proper logistic support, we could have stormed on and got to Berlin before the Germans were ready. But that if we had proper logistic support, that's a big ask when you're operating with a devastated Polish landscape behind you. And even at this stage, the Germans are very good as they pull back at destroying railway installations, destroying bridges, etc. Just the sheer problem of moving the tonnage of supplies required to the front line would be a daunting task under any circumstances and over a devastated landscape. It's just not physically possible. So I think that, I don't think pushing on to Berlin was ever the plan. I think if they were honest, they would say, we got a lot further than we expected, which is great. But at some point, at least, we really do have to stop. We have to gather our strength. And, these sort of it almost becomes a sort of vicious cycle. On the one hand, if you keep the advance going and the enemy doesn't get a chance to settle, you can sustain this because you don't have to have massive bombardments. The enemy isn't necessarily dug in well, etc., etc. As soon as you pause, even if it's just for a few days to bring up reinforcement supplies, whatever, your opponents start digging in. And then that immediately means you're going to need a lot more because you're going to have to get going again from a standing start, which requires artillery, it requires aviation, it requires proper reconnaissance, etc. So as soon as the decision is made to pause, it's going to be a big pause.
I feel like the one truth of every Eastern Front offensive is, if only the logistics were better, we could have XYZ. It's the classic problem given the size of the theater.
Well, it is. And the fascinating thing is that this, the legend that grew after the war of this highly technological, beautifully commanded Wehrmacht, exquisitely equipped, etc. And if it hadn't been for that pesky Hitler, we could have done so much. The bottom line is the Germans were almost as bad at logistics as the Soviets. After the war, when he was being debriefed by the US Army's Historical Division, Franz Halder, the former Chief of General Staff, said logistic constraints should never be allowed to limit the art of operations. And you just stop and pause and think, what does that even mean? How can logistic constraints not limit such things? And the Soviets have got better and better at this. They've realized, hey, we need to have a lot of trucks because railways are not going to be reliable until we've got them going again. Moreover, they have to repin all the railways to the Russian gauge so that they can run trains all the way through from their rear areas, and that all takes time. So those enormous numbers of trucks that have been sent over by the Americans and Canadians and British, and also the amount of fuel that's provided for them, and all the tinned food, the boring stuff. This is not sort of sexy tanks and bombs and planes. It's just the everyday stuff that keeps an army going. They actually have it in sufficient quantities that after a reasonable pause, they can go again. But it's extraordinary how, it took the Red Army several years of bitter experience to get here. And when we look at the recent performance of modern Russian armies, you realize how far they've gone backwards since that high moment in 1944-45.
Sometimes it's easy to forget that the boring stuff is what probably actually wins you wars. It is the tinned food in the trucks.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've always felt that for all of his self-promotion and his arrogance, the one thing that Montgomery did well was understand just the boring stuff and moving so much materiel into position that the conclusion was almost foregone from that point onwards.
One of the things I like asking authors as they kind of are writing books about topics, and I know you've kind of been on a journey through the Eastern Front over your last several books. Sort of around this topic, like what maybe surprised you the most during your research, or what opinion did you hold before you started your research that maybe your research and your writing changed over the course of creating the book?
That's a really interesting question. And my style of writing is that I tend to read things that interest me and find that they then provide material for probably the next 4 or 5 projects. So it's not as if I sit down and think, okay, for the next 3 weeks, I'm going to research the Vistula Oder operation. It's more a matter of I'm just constantly reading, looking at things, thinking, oh, that's interesting, etc. So I find my view on this evolves over quite a long period before the writing. I think there are a couple of things that really stand out. The first is just the unreliability of memoirs. As I've gone through this and I've become better at reading between the lines, so many of these German commanders who write about, Guderian or Manstein or others about conversations they had with Hitler, and I told him this and he was angry, but he had to give in. You read the memoirs and you think, so this was a conversation between 2 people. No one else is in the room, and one of those guys shoots himself in the head not long after. How reliable is this account? And increasingly you think, well, actually, probably not that reliable, given that they've been dishonest in other areas. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is just an awareness of how, despite continuing to suffer very, very heavy casualties by Western standards, how good the Red Army had got by this stage. Given its poor starting point, and given that compared to Western armies, it still doesn't have as much training, it doesn't have the incalculable value of the whole Western and German mindset of professional NCOs, people who have been in the service for a long time, who know how stuff is done, know how to look after recruits, get them up to speed quickly, who will make sure that tire pressures and oil levels are checked every night before people go to sleep, etc. In the Soviet forces, most of the NCOs are just the slightly better conscripts. And even without that backbone, without which no Western army would even think about going to war, the Soviets have actually learned to do it. And yep, they take terrible casualties way beyond what Western armies would tolerate and Western nations would tolerate. But they have come so far, and they've had to do this in the context of fighting for the survival of their nation. And all of the relaxation that has in top-down discipline that has come in order to allow the flexibility to operate on the modern battlefield. As soon as the war is over, Stalin just tightens up again, and all of that evaporates.
Yeah, it's almost by these late war offensives, the Soviet Red Army is still a blunt instrument, but they figured out how to wield it most effectively.
Exactly that, and they've also become much, much better at assessing the enemy's weakness, and they fully understand, okay, the Germans may be good, but they can't be good everywhere all the time. And if we hit enough points, we can then really reward the units that actually penetrate, we can reinforce success, and we're not going to waste effort taking stuff that we thought we would get early on, and we're just going to keep on attacking until either we'd run out of men or we take it. They're much, much more flexible by this stage of the war.
So looking ahead, do you have any future books, any future projects that are coming out soon on the Second World
War? Yes, I do. This one you can think of as the second in a trilogy. The first was Bagration, which came out recently. This one then takes the story on to the Oder. And the third in this trilogy, Berlin, comes out, I think, in May next year. That takes us through to the end of the war. Thereafter, I'm delighted to say that I'm involved in a lovely project, which is going to be a series of books entitled Cities at War. The first one deals with Warsaw, the next one with Paris, and the really lovely bit of this is I am co-authoring these with my daughter, which is just the most wonderful thing to be doing.
That is fun. That's a fun project.
Absolutely. She's a proper historian. She got a double first at Cambridge, and my goodness, when I read her contributions in the morning, when I go online and just look at what she's done, I'm just left thinking, yeah, it does make my writing look a bit pedestrian, really. She comes at it from a rather different angle, and it's just, you can imagine it's any parent's dream to do something like this with one of their offspring, and it's just been a great project.
You're gonna have to up your game.
Absolutely. Well, I suspect the order in which the authors are on the cover will change at a very early stage, and she'll get the credit that she undoubtedly deserves.
Fantastic. Well, I can't wait to check out that series.
Yeah, it should be good. It should be good. And, we have no idea where it'll go. When I was discussing this with some Americans not long ago, one of them said, have you thought of Manila? And I thought, wow, no, I haven't, but what a great idea, So who knows? Manila, Hiroshima, there could be all sorts of possible directions of travel with this.
There are a few cities involved with the war.
Well, indeed, and each city has its own unique experience, which draws on, this is a lovely thing. It then draws on the character of the population of that city, the unique geography of that city, etc., that nation's state and status within the world. So it's looking at, in some respects, fairly familiar things, but from a rather different perspective.
Well, thank you for that preview of your upcoming work, and thank you for talking to us about your new book, Into the Reich.
Well, thank you again for having me.